Hi everyone, my name is Ernest Jenavs. I'm a co-founder of Edurio. We are a research organization working on monitoring stakeholder feedback in schools and multi-academy trusts in the UK and internationally. We've brought together this webinar as we are in the midst of an uncertain period with many schools in various states of restriction, some fully working remotely, some in hybrid mode. And we wanted to use this opportunity to reflect on the past half year, really, and understand what has worked and what hasn't worked in remote setups, in disrupted learning, and hopefully share some ideas that will be helpful for everybody listening and afterwards the wider community as well. Today I'm very glad to be joined by Dominic Norrish, the Chief Operating Officer of United Learning, one of the largest multi-academy trusts in the UK, and a group that we've worked for the last 4 years, somebody who I highly respect and have always been grateful for his guidance around topics of learning and technology. So welcome, Dominic.
Thanks, Ernest. I almost believe some of that.
And we will also be joined by Emily Mullord, who is the head of Shrewton Church of England Primary School, part of Diocese Salisbury Multi-Academy Trust, who took part in the COVID-19 Impact Review that we will be talking about for some part of the session, and their school was one of the highest rated in community leadership as well as well-being. So welcome, Emily.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Excellent. So the way we're going to run the session is I'll start off in the first 10 to 15 minutes sharing some of the insights from our research, but then for the rest of the session we're really going to be spending in a conversation with Dominic from a trust perspective and Emily from a school perspective, trying to understand what has worked well in learning, well-being, community and leadership. And at that point we'll also be asking the attendees to share ideas that have worked for them. And we'll also be taking questions, so please use the Q&A functionality throughout the session. So let me just share my screen, and I will use. Excellent. So you should be able to see my screen. If you can't see my screen, then shout. But we will. I'll talk through some of the findings, really focusing on 5 lessons from our research over the last term. There we go. So essentially, over the in March, when schools entered crisis management mode, we had been working with a lot of trusts on monitoring stakeholder well-being, teaching and learning, and other aspects of education quality. When lockdown started, we refocused our work to really help people understand the impact of COVID-19 on their learning processes. And we were actively working at the time with United Learning and supporting them in pulse surveys of their stakeholders in trying to navigate the suddenly changing learning environment. In conversations, we felt that there is a lot that the wider sector needs to learn from each other. We're all experimenting, we're all trying to find out new things in the midst of some very difficult situations. And so we launched the COVID-19 Impact Review on Schools We worked together with Dominic and Sarah from United Learning on designing the questions. They were partially based on some of the themes that United Learning had explored before, and partially on our wider work on remote learning monitoring. The work was supported by a lot of organizations you can see on the slide, and we managed to gather feedback from 45,000 stakeholders across 277 schools, largely academy trusts, but also the maintained and independent sectors. Now, that then became the widest cross-stakeholder review of COVID-19 impact of schools in England. Since then, we've been working on producing research off the back of that. The first report that we launched end of August was focused on a status quo overview of how schools have coped with COVID-19. And that was followed by the second report, where we focused on lessons for school leaders. So trying to understand what actions by the schools had the biggest impact on the learning process, the well-being, and other aspects of the stakeholders' perceptions. And these are some of the findings that I'll be sharing with you today. Both these reports are available and will be shared to all attendees along with some other resources and the recording of this webinar. So the four themes we explored were the learning, community, well-being, and leadership. These were essentially designed by looking at, well, learning is a core aspect of any education establishment, and we're looking at how possible is it to maintain a learning environment throughout this period. We then looked at well-being, because that was largely at a threat, both well-being from school leaders, teachers, staff members, but also the pupils themselves and the parents. Everybody was fighting a lot of anxiety, a lot of their own unique challenges. Community was a topic we explored with intention of addressing an area that is difficult to maintain throughout this period. And finally, leadership is something that the aspects of school leadership and the relationship between school leaders and the staff and the wider community have been identified to be at the core of inclusive and stable work environment and pleasant relationships throughout the school. So those were the four themes. We validated them with a lot of stakeholders. And I'll ask Dominic, because you also influenced these themes. It'd be interesting to hear how you were thinking about monitoring and exploring the themes when the lockdown started. So just reflecting on that experience a little bit.
Yeah, well, we already had, as you mentioned, our pulse surveys were underway. So our schools did not end up answering the Edurio survey, but we did have very similar content, very similar themes. As you suggest, these are things that every school should be concerned about. That's also true of the research literature. So there's quite a lot of findings that are already quite well understood that could be compared with what we learned from this new information. And equally, I think they're quite exhaustive as well. So there's nothing that we wanted to ask that didn't fit under one of these headings. So they felt like quite a natural fit, really. Obviously, the kind of leadership one is a bit harder to translate into kind of pupil questions. They don't have an enormously strong grasp on the quality of leadership at the school. Well, they probably do, actually. It's just not necessarily the one that the adults would agree with. So those questions took a slightly different inflection. But yeah, these felt like the right ways of trying to make sense of what was a very complicated and contextual set of questions asked across three hugely diverse groups of people.
Thank you very much. I will now walk through some of the findings that we saw. I will not mirror the structure of the reports, which is kind of looking at the results in a lot more depth. I'll essentially run through 5 conclusions and 5 suggestions from our work. Before I do that, a quick positive message to everyone. Both staff members and parents, when asked how confident are you with the school's actions in response to COVID-19 disruption, the majority of them felt positive about the way their schools were tackling the situation. And while there is a lot of media coverage with doubts and concerns, etc., the research showed that staff members as well as parents really saw the effort that school leaders were putting into this. They appreciated the complexities of the situation and those overwhelming support of what the schools were doing. So that's a really positive message for all schools and trusts out there. Likewise, pupils, in general, over half of pupils reported that they were coping well with the current situation. And this is June to July 2020 when the research took place. However, with 16% saying they didn't cope well, that is something that obviously needs to be addressed because schools have responsibility to provide good education for all, not just for the majority that is coping well. So now looking at some of those themes in more detail. And as I said, I'll be trying to identify some of the lessons for school leaders in particular. So the first lesson that we found very interesting was the learning methods that were applied. Now, obviously, in the summer term, there was a lot of different approaches taken across schools in England. There wasn't very clear guidance on what is the expected level of learning to be provided. There wasn't a clear approach on how digital or paper-based it should be. So we tried to look at the various methods that were applied. And this is the most complicated slide I'll walk you through, so it'll get a bit more straightforward after that. But we looked at various methods applied in primary and secondary school, and we measured how having those methods in the mix influenced the pupil's sense of learning progress. So, for example, recording videos, those who experienced recording videos in their learning in the summer term were 18% more likely to be positive about learning progress in secondary school or 14% in the primary school. Now, the interesting findings here is that in general, we see that things like recording videos score really well, and that supports the idea that there should be an opportunity for pupils to create work, not just take in lessons. But also watching recorded video lessons had a positive impact, and higher positive impact, I should say, than following live lessons online. Learning tasks digitally had higher score than learning tasks on paper, but in general, a mix of learning methods seemed to have the best results in primary and secondary. Another interesting finding was that the learning, and this is where we looked at how many pupils were positive, neutral, or negative about their learning progress, depending on how they answered what share of their lessons have been live online. And interestingly, the share of lessons live online didn't have a material progress on didn't have a material correlation with how likely pupils are to be positive about their learning. This was the case in secondary as well as primary school. So overall, the finding there is that we need to be creative in how we plan our learning methods, and every school will have their unique mix, but it's not, the answer isn't just do everything live online and it'll be easy. School leaders and teachers need to work really hard to align the learning methods to provide a mix. The second lesson was around coordinating pupil workload. We asked a set of questions around the workload of pupils, so how many hours per day they spend on schoolwork remotely. And this is the chart where, again, we see pupils' perceptions of progress, so positive, neutral, negative, green being positive, red being negative, depending on how many hours per day they reported spending on schoolwork. And it seemed that 5 to 6 hours was the highest ranking, highest rated workload. Interestingly, it wasn't only from the learning progress perspective, but when we ran similar statistics on the well-being of pupils, how frequently they felt stressed, there as well, 3 to 6 hours had the lowest stress and associated with them. And pupils who spent less than 1 hour or more than 6 hours reported being more stressed at work. So coordinating workload is really, really challenging in remote setup when different teachers are responsible for their parts of the curriculum. And so that is something that schools who reported having a shared approach where they coordinated the workload across the entire school setting had a more positive experience. The third takeaway from our work is about involving your parent communities as partners in learning. The way parents were involved with learning fundamentally changed in the last term, especially in primary school, I should say. If we looked at how parents were feeling about the school's handling of COVID-19, we saw that the highest correlating factor was how able the school was to support them in helping their children. So parents who said that the school helped them support their child's learning very well, 96% of them were positive about the school's handling of the disruption, whereas from those who said they didn't get the support, less than a quarter were positive about the school's response. So that was one of the key factors in the parents' overall feeling about how the school was doing. Similarly, the parents' confidence on how well they were able to support their child had a strong impact on how parents were feeling about their child's progress. So that's by helping the parents feel more confident in how they can support their child at home, schools were able to boost the confidence in the child's learning materially. And the final aspect there, and I'll ask Dominic later to comment on that part in particular, parents who felt involved in shaping the school's response and parents who felt listened to were much more confident in the school's response. And so even though parents were having their own anxieties and their own difficulties, if they felt they had the opportunity to be involved in the school's response, as is true for their overall involvement in the school's work, they were a lot more positive about the way the school was managing. So that's the third finding. Fourth finding from our work was the idea of over-communicating. Communication. So this is two charts where we again look at how different factors, in this case, how the parents and staff members' response to the question on the clarity of communication from school leaders, how that linked with their satisfaction of the school's handling of COVID-19 disruption. So parents who were who felt the communication was very clear were also, almost all of them, were highly positive about the school's response. Same for staff members. And again, parents and staff members who were not clear about what's going on were also losing confidence very rapidly. So this is a case where I know a lot of schools were concerned about, well, we don't know what's going on. We don't know what the communication is that we should be putting out. So should we wait until there's more clarity? Should we wait until we have a good, strong response that demonstrates us as competent leaders? The lessons from parents and staff members was a resounding focus on transparency. And even if we don't know all the answers, even if we don't have the clarity ourselves, telling the parents and staff community what we know and what we don't know is something that leads to a lot higher confidence in the learning process, a lot higher trust. And that's another thing to then emphasize, is that we shouldn't be shy about communication when there is disruption. We should be focusing on rather erring on the over-communication side instead of under-communicating. And the final point I wanted to highlight from our work is setting clear well-being support paths. And I know a lot of schools are working on it, and I'll ask Emily to share some of their work around that. But when we asked parents on how easy or difficult has it been for your child to get support for mental and emotional well-being, we found that that had a direct impact on how their child was feeling emotionally. So how frequently they were being stressed or not coping well emotionally. So 73% of the parents who said it was easy to get emotional and mental well-being said that their child was coping well, whereas only 1 in 10 parents, for those who said it was difficult to get mental and emotional support, well-being support, said that there was a positive experience. This was echoed by the pupil responses, and this is why I raised that, as that's a concerning statistic, that when we asked pupils, how often have you had somebody from the school to talk to if you've been feeling unwell, sad, stressed, or lonely? A third of pupils said they never had somebody to talk to, and only a third said that always or mostly they had access to people to talk to at school. For staff, actually there's a similar message, and in this chart we asked staff members what support from the school's leadership has been most valuable to you this term. Communication came top, and this is the reason why I also mentioned over communicating in the previous slide. But the second was encouragement and providing feedback to staff. And right next to that, along with health and safety guidance, was emotional well-being and support. Those were more frequently mentioned than teaching support or provision of learning materials and methodological support. So when that support is given, it's really appreciated. But on the other side, we also asked, what support would you value more of? And similarly here, staff members said that they would like more emotional well-being support and encouragement in providing feedback to staff. So this was an interesting message that within the disruption, while everybody was struggling and working, trying to do the best they can to provide learning within this very difficult time, emotional well-being support from the school leaders was needed and appreciated by staff members much more than methodological support. So those are the 5 messages that the research shows, and as I said, there's much more, many more charts under that, underneath that. But essentially, there's a learning part, which is planning the learning method mix and coordinating pupil workload, which also has an impact on their well-being. There's strong focus on involving the parents as partners in the community. And then from a leader's perspective, there's over-communication and very clear and rapid communication, as well as clearly defining but also demonstrating what the well-being support that is available to pupils, families, and staff members is. So I will now stop sharing, and we can get to the more interesting part of the conversation, where we don't have to look at the charts, but we can talk to the practitioners who are part of this call, who can reflect on some of that. And Dominic, I'm going to start with you, because I know that you've invested a lot of time and effort in setting, in particular focusing on the learning side of things and setting clear learning strategies. And by the way, I will also share in the chat 2 webinars that Dominic managed, specifically deep diving into this. But Dominic, would you be able to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that you have applied in managing learning throughout this period of disruption?
Sure. Okay. And lots of it echoes the evidence in your report, Ernest. You'll be glad to hear. the first thing that we knew from really early on was that we should build whatever strategy we were going to put together on already well understood processes of teaching. So, for example, we know that the clarity that a teacher can explain something with has an enormous impact on a child's ability to learn. So for our primary schools, we focused on them using tools like their visualizers, for example, and a tool called Microsoft Sway to allow them to explain things really clearly in a way that could be seen by children, even if all they had access to was a parent's mobile phone. And that rapidly progressed through lockdown, where quite often teachers were recording videos of themselves explaining things as well, which had a really knock-on impact to that. Things you mentioned, Ernest, about kind of well-being and how connected children were feeling and how lonely they were feeling, that became quite important. And at secondary, a very similar model, slightly different tools. We had most schools began by recording what we called voiceover PowerPoints. So that's a PowerPoint presentation where your voice is recorded over the top, and sometimes the teachers would record themselves, windowed, just like in this Zoom call as well as a video, which again had the impact of making sure that children could still access really high quality teaching and understand from people that they knew and trusted and whose language they understood, because they've been in their lesson, that they knew exactly what these people were talking about, that these teachers, that had a huge impact. And that's actually reflected in the findings of your surveys. Teacher clarity really coming high up the list of things that children valued when they were talking about their progress. We did encourage schools to move towards live lessons, although very cautiously, because I think, like you, we realized that the best offer here was a blended one, which would have some books and paper, some asynchronous things like a recorded PowerPoint and a Microsoft Sway, and the occasional live lesson. And secondary schools particularly use that increasingly. Actually, interestingly, children reported, particularly the older the children, that the asynchronous stuff, so the recordings of their teachers, was more valuable to them because of their ability to rewatch things that they didn't understand, which you don't necessarily get in a live lesson. So that was interesting as well. And what was the last thing I'd say? Oh, just a comment on your recording of videos finding as being the kind of most powerful, or children who perceived they'd made the most progress saw that as being the most powerful thing. So I just think we should, sorry, not particularly on message here, but I think we should approach that with a bit of caution based on the fact that, and this is just a hypothesis, but children who had access to the tools to record their own videos, which isn't that easy still, you'd need a decent device and quite a lot of capital, educational capital to know what you're doing. So that might just be a proxy for, level of parental income or, their relative advantage, basically. And maybe we shouldn't be so surprised that, children who are already doing well and i.e. know how to make videos themselves also continue to make progress through lockdown. The finding that's one down from that in your graph, actually, the watching recorded video lessons as being a very powerful, something that had lots of impact on their perception of progress is perhaps more universal. All children had access to that where their schools were making it. So is that enough for me on that?
Yeah, and fully take on board the point on recording videos. I should also note that was also the least frequently mentioned element of learning. So there is some caution to that. Emily, I'd love to hear first about how you managed the learning process throughout this period, and can you just share a little bit about kind of your story throughout the disruption, how you've kind of managed that throughout?
Yeah, I think similar to what Dominic was just saying, we took a very blended approach straight away. Our families were finding the recorded sessions much more valuable, and I think the point that sort of what Dominic just said that made me think of was that the recorded videos allowed our parents to watch them first. So it wasn't like they were learning alongside their child. There was the opportunity for them to be just a little bit ahead. We also found that using live lessons and recorded lessons meant that the children only needed the technology for the input part of the lesson. They were then able to go and record their work in a different manner, be it all creative or in a written book, and we provided workbooks for them all. So I think that was a really good balance. I know that our families were very pleased with us uploading weekly timetables, so that they knew what we'd be doing in school and at what time. And I think that very much gave them a sense of authority in terms of, your teachers are saying it's 10 o'clock, you should be now starting your maths lesson. That's what we're going to do. I think that sort of took the pressure off them to be instigating it and sort of gave them a bit of backup. So they found that really useful. And children, although they will probably deny it, they really enjoy learning and they really enjoy being in a routine. So actually to see the timetable for the week and see what they were doing, and knowing that all the other children in their class were doing that as well at the same time, automatically gave them a much greater sense of community and togetherness, because they could see what the whole class were doing. They were then uploading what they'd produced onto our blog platform, and they could see that they were all doing the same. So that was quite powerful. So that was the most beneficial. In terms of the live sessions, we very much went from using those as teaching inputs to actually just more wellbeing catch-ups. So the opportunity where they were able to log on to a live session and just have a chat with either myself or their class teacher and just talk to each other about what's going on. You know, we had things like children showing their new chickens, or, you know, like a piece of artwork, or, you know, you can't predict what they're gonna, which is also a bit of a caution message, you can't predict what they're going to show. But I think doing those weekly opposed to as many live lessons was much more powerful in terms of them feeling together throughout that time. So that's really how we managed the learning side of it.
Excellent, and really nice to see you kind of mentioning the well-being side of it, because clearly the process is very connected. You can't detach the learning process from the well-being elements. Your school scored particularly highly in the report around the community and the well-being aspects of it. So would you be able to share some more of your magic sauce to understand how you're able to maintain a strong community and well-being throughout this period?
Yeah, I think when I saw the 4 areas, you know, the leadership, the community, and the communication, like that, and the well-being, if you don't have those 3 bits, then the learning's not going to happen. So we really focused on living out our vision and values. You know, we're a C of E school, we're part of a C of E trust. We all, you know, we have a strapline that's beyond expectations for all God's children, and that's what the staff completely, you know, embodied and followed. We started the wellbeing work, we started by delegating staff to focus on different groups of pupils. So staff across the school, depending on their skill set, had a focus group of children to look after, essentially, and that involved phone calls regularly. That involved them making sure they had access to any interventions they would have been having in school. In some cases, you know, we're very lucky that we're in a village, and we had TAs that were willing to go to the end of the garden and drop off books and hear children read from, you know, from a significant distance, but also to check on then those certain families that needed that. So that was the first wave, if you like, making sure that every member of staff had just a manageable group to oversee and check in on. And then we put a lot into living out our values, our school values. So we had a YouTube channel, and we started to emulate all of the collective worship sessions that we would have had in school. So on a Monday, I myself or another senior leader would record the first video of the week using our language values, using that community language that then parents were also a part of. And I think one thing that really struck me when we partially reopened in June was the families that we were having back. So a lot of our disadvantaged families, a lot of our key worker families, a lot of vulnerable children. I could hear the parents mirroring the language that we'd been using in our YouTube videos. So we knew that they were being watched. You can obviously count the views. But from that alone, it then gave us a greater sense of community and togetherness, even though we were really far away. We have a line in our school prayer that is, it's not the bricks that make the school, it is us. And we really focused on that in every single worship, the fact that we are all together still. We then finished that on a Friday with a live worship all together. So families were then welcome to join us and celebrate and see how they'd been shown that theme of the week and those values as well. And I think it was through that we sort of built that sense of community. We then brought in sort of elements of spirituality and well-being through daily messages. You know, over communication was my strap line throughout this whole thing. We communicated with our families daily. They got a message every single morning from a senior leader saying, good morning, happy Monday, this is what is going on today, hope you're feeling all right. And, you know, and that some days that just became like little memes, you know, like thank goodness it's Friday, and a little animal that's throwing its little hands up in the air or something, just so they know we were always there. And it opened up that two-way communication that families could then contact us and feel really comfortable with doing that. And I think you were spot on when you said about being transparent. I regularly wrote emails where I said, I'd love to be able to give you the answer, I don't know. The best thing you can do is carry on as we are and not worry. To some days being like, do you know what, it's been quite a full-on week, don't worry so much this Friday. Here's an activity linked to our school value, have a crack at that instead. Because I think, you know, parents were under a lot of pressure. A lot of them were trying to work as well from home, juggle multiple children. And we made a decision to go to a whole school topic for the summer term and for this term as well. So that when they were at home, they were still then had the same focus across all of their siblings, and they were just engaging with the activities at different levels. So that, you know, that sort of, and the last thing I would say is that when we were addressing our families, we were addressing the whole family, not just parents, but we were writing to the children as well, but also supporting parents' well-being and sort of showing that transparency and that humanization, and saying, do you know what, it's all right if you're finding this really tough. We're not just talking to children, we're talking to you. So sort of being that sounding board for parents made communication really strong, community really strong, and as a result, well-being really strong.
Thank you, Emily. Really, really interesting to hear that. Now, I mean, some might say it's easy for you to manage community, for you have a relatively small school. Dominic, I mean, United Learning has schools from very small schools to massive schools. What well-being strategies have you seen that work across the range between the different schools?
All right, you want one simple answer that works everywhere. Okay. Well, actually, you've just heard it, I think. The principles that Emily set out there do map everywhere. I think I'd particularly say the kind of over communication to parents is critical. I think one of the mistakes that some schools made was thinking they'd communicated something, which is always illusory, unless you've really pushed it rather than expecting people to come and find it. So, you know, a tweet about something isn't really communication. So, for example, all of our schools, we made sure that on the very front page of their website was a banner that said, parents, click here for information about remote learning. And that linked also to a page about what they could do to support their children. So putting that front and center and just ensuring that's everywhere and that you're regularly talking about that. I think the other key thing about wellbeing for pupils and parents is, instead of having live learning, instead of having lessons, using that time, as Emily said, to just get people together, you know, so children can show each other their cats. I mean, that's a common theme that happened quite a bit. And some kind of element of normality where children are actually talking to each other. Because if we come back to the findings in your report, you know, the threats to pupil wellbeing, the things that they identified as being related to their stress, you know, feelings of loneliness, lacking motivation, didn't understand what they needed to be working on. I mean, that all points back to the fact that I suspect many children just not actually talking to each other or to adults, not having that opportunity. So in terms of a kind of a tech response to that, schools need to make sure that they have a decent digital online platform that will allow them to host kind of large video events, which might be the whole school. I mean, we've seen lots of great examples of senior leaders having, you know, hundreds of children in a call like this with their parents, with effective safeguarding things in place, of course. But so if schools haven't yet got that, vital that you do. There's money for this from the Department for Education. They've got something called the Get Help with Technology programme, which is effectively titled, which will help schools transition to Office 365 or Google G Suite. So that is a crucial thing. And that once you've got that as well, that also helps you to deliver learning in a synchronous or asynchronous way, where you can exemplify things so children don't feel that they don't understand, for example. And then the last thing I'd say about well-being that's really important, and this is a non-tech one really. So staff well-being is obviously a huge problem in uncertain times, particularly when you ask them to do new things and it's taking a lot more time. So kind of perceptions of workload, and where people felt that their well-being was best looked after was where head teachers and deputies and SLT were actually actively talking to individual teachers about how they were feeling. So it's coming back to this communication point. And there's a really clear theme throughout your research that shows the impact of leadership on all of the positives and all of the perceptions of negatives in every single section. So where leadership is weak, there's a very strong correlation with people feeling negative about other aspects. The good news about that is, leadership is entirely within the control of school leaders. That's not a tech-driven thing. That's it probably takes longer to improve and is somewhat innate. But it's that and communication are things that you can do something about immediately.
Wonderful, thank you. For all attendees, if you have any questions, there is a Q&A button below your screen where you can add those. So please do that. Now, in the meanwhile, we spoke about community, and this is a question to both Dominic and Emily. A worrying trend that we saw was that over half of pupils said they never collaborated with other pupils during the summer term, and that is obviously difficult to do remotely on Zoom. It's much more difficult to collaborate, and there are safety concerns around that. So, have you seen ways to enable communication between pupils to collaborate on a piece of work with each other?
Oh, who's going to go first? Well, we have found our blogging platform really useful. It was secure, so the pupils had to have an additional login on our website, and that meant that they could upload things they were doing, whether that was learning based or just something that a new skill they'd learned, or the fact that they'd baked some bread and learned how to do that. They could comment on each other. We have another school in our trust that are using Seesaw really well, and Shobi. So lots of different platforms where they can have live feedback and share and talk to each other during sessions as well. So those are the sort of things that worked really well for us.
And just to build on that, I think in a really safe way, if you can find a sealed system, so a good example of that would be Office 365. So the only people getting in there are people with logins. Then your safeguarding concerns are much lower. Obviously, you'll want to be able to audit what's happening in there, so you don't want children being able to do things without you seeing it. But document collaboration is quite powerful. So groups of children working on the same Word document or same PowerPoint presentation, where they're commenting, able to in a kind of as I say, monitorable, safe way, talk to each other. That comes back to my point again. You really do need to be on the cloud to enable to unlock all of those benefits.
Thank you. Now, Dominic already started talking about the importance of relationship between the school leader and the staff members. So supporting their well-being, not just the pupil and parent community. So Emily, could you talk from a school leader's perspective on how easy or difficult it was for you to have those relationships with your staff members throughout the period?
Yeah, I think it comes back down to timetabling your communication, if you like. I think if I was to analyse how much time I spent sort of just talking to people during that period of remote learning, it's probably the majority of my time, talking to everybody, checking in with everybody, using things like Microsoft Teams to have those collaborative professional development sessions, and to still feel like you're investing in your people, but also finding a balance of understanding they were doing work from home and it was all new for them. I think education is probably the only sector you can work in where you can learn things very, very fast and on the go. You know, we've had TAs go from being almost tech illiterate to being able to support and meet the people on Microsoft Teams. But also just saying thank you goes a long way. Publicly thanking staff to parents, saying, you know, we genuinely would not be doing this well if it wasn't for every single person from the office team, you know, sending out regular updates and all the paperwork to, you know, all the way through to our TAs and teachers at all levels. Publicly thanking staff is really, really powerful. And actually another powerful element in terms of the wellbeing community was thanking parents regularly and saying, do you know what, we really appreciate that we're giving you all of this, but you are actually engaging, because if you weren't, we wouldn't be getting as far. So making time to say thank you and check in, and making sure that, you know, as we've come back into it, that, you know, they're supported in terms of, you know, we're doing a lot less marking, and making their workload significantly more manageable so that we can get this balance right. And focus on what's really important. And just, I think, again, communicating with them and them knowing that you're actively working on those things to help them, as long as they know you're doing something, they feel supported. So it's about that over communication, that transparency again. And also little regular wellbeing bulletins that we had from the trust helped, that we could then devolve down at school level with little helpful, you know, self-help reminders or mindfulness moments or just ideas. And actually from trust level, giving staff permission to go off and take a walk in a lunch break, opposed to feeling like you've got to be at your screen the whole time. Sort of just giving those suggestions and giving them permission was quite powerful as well.
Thank you for highlighting the simple element of saying thank you, because that is something that we saw throughout our research, that staff members who felt appreciated by the school leader, who felt appreciated by the parent community and who had a good relationship with them, were much more likely to have positive well-being. So in a period of uncertainty, it's important that everybody shows appreciation, which is difficult sometimes to do remotely. But now, I mean, there has been a lot of strain on obviously everybody in the system, but more than most, the school leaders. And it was interesting for us to see that, for example, in terms of workload, actually the research we were doing during the COVID-19 disruption, staff members in schools in general reported they had better workload than prior to COVID-19 disruption. So, however, school leaders and IT support teams in schools reported that their workload was a lot worse. And so, Dominic, and after that, Emily as well, how did you work from a trust perspective to support the school leadership teams in particular? And then afterwards, I know, Emily, you're also part of a trust. I'd love your perspective from a leader's perspective. How did that relationship with the trust work for you? So, Dominic.
So I think the most important thing we did was, you know, stop and ask really about head teachers' well-being. We did our own survey of that to understand what they were concerned about. And one of the major concerns that came up was actually, I mean, beyond the huge things such as, you know, you just don't know what next Tuesday is going to bring, and just staying, you can't plan with any certainty. And the other one being really kind of operational concerns, you know, dealing with things that you didn't plan to deal with, completely robbing you of any strategic capacity. Those are massive things. We learned quite quickly to communicate through one channel only. So very quickly, it became the only person who was sending head teachers communication was the CEO, at most once a day. Following feedback, we stopped sending those things at any time. If the little hand had gone past 4 in the afternoon, that was no more emails at that point, and never on a Friday. So kind of a sensitive, you know, no one likes getting dumped with a huge piece of advice late on. I don't know if you can still hear me, Ernest. I think my audio might be cutting in and out a bit.
We can hear you well.
Okay. And I suppose on the kind of positive side of things, rather than what we didn't do, what we did do was take away as much of the stress as we could. So, one of the advantages of being in a trust is that there's someone whose specific job is health and safety, who knows all about the law and could provide really clear advice on what the government was saying. Similarly, with you mentioned kind of IT support staff, the fact that we had a digital strategy for all of our schools very quickly and lots of training in place meant that no one was trying to work it out on their own. And that's not much help if you're not part of a trust. But that certainly removed some of the sources of stress from leaders in the school.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Being on the receiving end of sort of trust leads, really helpful that we had a whole academy improvement team that were sort of sifting their way through the huge deluge of information that was coming out every single day and prioritizing what we needed to action and what we should be thinking about on any given day, because just sharing that understanding that we can't do everything at once. Again, we only had those updates from the CEO, so we knew to look out for that and then what we'd have to follow, and then off the back of that, creating head teacher board meetings online where we could meet in a safe space as head teachers and sort of just air our concerns, get to the bottom of things, take ideas from each other and implement them. That very quickly went from sort of strategic and operational and logistical support to much more emotional and wellbeing support, because it became a really safe space. And we're still doing them now every other week to get our heads together and help solve each other's problems or just talk things through. And then also positively, we were able to capitalize on everybody being at home and put in some really strong professional development for staff at all levels, where you don't have to travel to a set space to have a course from all over. You could suddenly do it online. And we're very fortunate to have a trust lead teacher program in place that meant that every year group could have somebody that leading a meeting that they could all just dip into and go, this is what I'm worried about, this is what we're doing, somebody have an idea for this, and sort of creating a much larger teaching learning community among the whole trust was really good for staff wellbeing, but also meant that people were still able to learn and grow and develop during this time. We spent a lot of time investing in our subject leads as well. So actually, as we've come back, they're at a much stronger starting point than before lockdown, because they've been able to engage in professional development online in a slightly different way. And that was all set up from our trust as well. So those things in particular were really useful to know that, like Dominic was saying, as a head, I didn't feel I had the time to be able to manage curriculum development and subject knowledge and monitoring and strategic stuff. But actually the fact that was then led by the trust meant I could just focus on the day-to-day and the setup. So that was very helpful for us.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll ask a couple more questions around the kind of the path forward, but as we are nearing the end of the hour that we've allocated for this, I have a request for all the attendees. Because we will consolidate the lessons from this seminar, and we'll write a post to share those wider. I know there are a lot of people who have roles in schools and trusts who have had their own unique situation, who've had their own ideas to implement to improve learning, well-being, community feeling, or leadership. So if I could ask everybody to think about what you would like to share with the rest of the community, and type that into the chat, adding your school or trust name if you're happy to share that. And you can write that to all panelists or just myself. And we will then consolidate these as lessons for the wider community and release that together. So please, in the last 5 minutes, if I could ask everybody to share some thoughts from their perspective. But now a forward-looking question to Emily and Dominic. How is it different now compared to July or August? We're kind of moving forward. There's some different guidance. There's a lot more that we've learned about what works and what doesn't. What do the next months look for you, Emily? How are you going to tackle some of those risks going forward?
I think for us, if I sort of keep it learning focused, the thing I'm most concerned about is still staff well-being and the balance of teaching a full open school and supporting home learning for children who are potentially going to be isolating, and possibly increasingly so. We will probably have children that will be isolating more than once, because different family members may get symptoms at any one time. So I think for us, managing the balance and staff workload, because to run a class full time and then also do home learning could be a significant challenge. We've come up with a 3-tiered approach, so that there's on the tier 1 is home learning for if you were just waiting for a test result. Tier 2 is remote learning if you're isolating for 14 days, and tier 3 is if we're in a much different place, more of a local lockdown or high situation. But for me, that making sure they've got feedback and managing the staff time is a priority, and something we're really working on going forwards, because you don't want people to be doing twice the work just on site and remotely.
Yeah, that's, completely unsustainable, isn't it? If you're trying to teach for 5 hours and then do the same effectively, or at least plan it for, the 2 children who are isolating at home. So we're helping to support schools to try and do both things at the same time. So the safe sharing of live lessons with children who aren't there. And also key to doing that well is not creating any risk at either end, but making sure that basically what you're doing in the classroom in front of 28 children, you can not compromise in any way and still make accessible and actually quite useful to children who are studying from home. So that's going to be critical to get that right. I should mention, by the way, when I talked about kind of sources of support that we were able to give our schools, there is a currently not that well-known program from DfE called the EdTech Demonstrator Program, Demonstrator Schools Program, that all schools can access to get support on these specific issues. So definitely make use of that if you don't happen to be, in a trust or someone that can provide that for you. The other thing that I think the next few months will bring is the need to tackle recruitment and retention. In a kind of ongoing COVID environment. We've seen our retention of teachers, change, obviously, as you'd expect, when no one resigned, really, as they normally might in the spring and summer terms, just because of the uncertainty. That doesn't mean people don't want new jobs. It just means all of that's in the post. So that's a challenge to think about. And similarly, how do we best support teacher development in this new world? As Emily said, that's actually been quite a boon. The fact that people have got very used to and very comfortable with attending things like this, where they were able to learn, but not spend a day traveling to it. And we actually found, as I mentioned at the start, we did 3 pulse surveys over the course of May, June and July. And we found that teachers' concerns about workload declined throughout on each month, and their plans to engage in CPD increased as they obviously got more time and felt a bit less worried. So I think even post-COVID, I don't think teacher CPD is going to look the same ever again. That's a real positive, really. Similarly with flexible working, everyone's found that they can work at home, even as teachers. We've got a whole bunch of people who are not in the workforce at the moment because, the very structured nature of school has prevented them from working in ways that suited the flexibility they need. And I think that might change too. So finding ways to integrate kind of former teachers back into the workforce flexibly will be something we'll be thinking about too.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dominic. It's a nice end to the discussion, because it's now that we are in a situation with some uncertainty, we've learned some lessons and we are implementing them across the schools. It is important to look beyond that and not just say what can we do to kind of fix the current challenges, but also what can we take from this and implement in our work going further. In our report, there was feedback from staff members and parents around various elements around technology, around well-being that schools can continue using beyond COVID disruption. Thanks to all those who've added their thoughts in the chat. We will now wrap up the session. Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Emily. Really, really appreciate your input. So a virtual clap going your way. We will share some of the resources that United Learning have published around remote education. So we'll share those with the attendees. Webinars for primary and secondary schools led by Dominic that go really deep into some of the aspects of providing learning throughout this period. You can read more of Emily's experience in a case study in the report that we'll distribute, as well as a case study from Glemsford Primary Academy, part of the Unity Schools Partnership. So both reports will be shared with you alongside other resources. We will continue doing research on COVID-19 disruption. So if your school or trust would like to participate in some of that, let me know. And thanks everybody for spending their time joining. And thanks again, Dominic and Emily. I'll stay on the chat for a while in case anyone else would like to share some of their lessons. But we are now closing the webinar. Thanks, everyone.